My full intention tonight is to be able to give you 6 practical ideas on how you can implement and teach a student sign language in the mainstream classroom who doesn't already sign or they don't have a strong enough foundation of sign for their interpreter to be useful. At the end of the training, I'm going to talk about 4 legitimate circumstances that a school may have that makes them resistant to getting an interpreter and what to do if that's the case. So let's go ahead and dig right in because I know that this is a very hot topic. I hear it all the time. Honestly, it's a passion of mine. So I want you right now to imagine a student who is hard of hearing in the mainstream classroom, and they don't have enough auditory access to fully access their education. So maybe the student wears hearing aids or maybe cochlear implants, and maybe they can even have a decent conversation with you or their teacher, maybe even their peers. However, it's been discovered that they don't have full access to their instruction. And therefore, they're starting to struggle to make social and academic gains, the kind that we expect them to make at their age. It wouldn't surprise me if this is easy for you to envision because you may have an actual student that comes to mind as I say these words. But as soon as this is discovered, the use of sign language interpreters, or for the conversation, I'm going to talk about cued speech, anything visual, a visual language should absolutely be addressed. However, if a student doesn't already sign or isn't utilizing their interpreter, I completely recognize the challenge and the complex situation that this brings to the table. So, if you are familiar with the 2023 landmark court case, Perez versus Sturgis School District, this is very impactful. This landmark court case shows us what can happen if we don't provide appropriately for these students. So we've got kids that have auditory access like they've never had before. And then we've got today's interpreter shortage and a teacher of the deaf shortage. And then there's fewer classrooms than we ever had, fewer options of students, less self contained classrooms or schools for the deaf. We've got many schools for the deaf that are even closing. And then one of the things that I see as this requirement from the law to provide LRE. The LRE law is that students with disabilities are educated with peers who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. We hear this, and so we get a big push for our students to be in the general ed classroom. But of course, we know that when a child isn't making progress, when they're struggling socially, when the language gaps are growing, when they aren't thriving, then it is time for the school to figure out how to provide true access. So I often hear this phrase, they don't use sign language, so we're not going to provide an interpreter. We shouldn't be asking the question of if the student uses sign language. The question that we need to be asking is if the student has access. Now, with that being said, I am a strong believer that we cannot just put an interpreter in front of a student who doesn't know sign language and expect for them to learn sign language just by that person being in front of them. So, we're going to talk about what to do in this situation and how to really support their learning of the language. So, let me introduce you to Miguel. This is the boy that has changed our fields from here on out. The scenario that I gave you in the very beginning when I told you to imagine a student is very reminiscent of the situation that Miguel was in. Miguel needed access to the curriculum and he needed it through sign language. But the school didn't provide anyone who knew sign language, but instead they provided him with a one on one aide who provided communication support. This is because they couldn't find an interpreter. So Miguel was in the mainstream setting and he went to mainstream classes and he went to special ed classes. He went with his aide, but his aide was often pulled or she was absent or whatever the case may be. So he was in the class without anybody. And the teachers gave Miguel A's on his report card and passed him through, even though he was not learning the curriculum. But the school felt that they were providing him with his LRE because he had special ed classes, he had mainstream classes, and he had a one on one aide who was a communication support that was meeting his communication needs. That's what they thought. But they were wrong. And the school got sued for denial of fate. Here is the news articles. Deaf Michigan man, I suffered permanent harm after years of inadequate education. Here's the other headline. District failed him. The Supreme Court will decide. I'm going to share exactly what happened, where they went awry with their plans, and what happened next. Here's something that always amazes me that often does not get considered. When a person is in prison, what is the biggest punishment a person can get? Yeah, solitary confinement, right? Isolation. They put you in a room where you can't have any communication. You don't have any socialization with people. And that's where you stay. And yet, many of our students live in the solitary confinement for years because they don't have anybody to communicate with. And if they don't have an interpreter, they really don't have anybody to communicate with. So, we are having many of our students who don't have this communication be in this isolation situation that can be very damaging to their psychological and their social and emotional development and needs. As we know, DHH students need to have assessments to identify their full extensive needs. So I would be curious, I would like to know, what does that mean to you? Language gaps, vocabulary deficits, social and emotional development, auditory function, psychological language levels, audiogram and interpretation, vocab, pragmatics. And by the way, I also want to point out that when we're looking at audiological access and what a student can access and hear, we also want to make sure that we're identifying what they understand, right? I love the FLE, I love it, but it does only have us have a student say word for word back. It doesn't actually ask any comprehension questions. So it is one piece of the puzzle. But if a student can't answer any comprehension question, okay, we've got more to talk about. The other thing that is really valuable for us to assess and identify is a nonverbal IQ. So that is something that your school psych should be doing. And I always like to say, make sure that your students have a nonverbal IQ done, and a nonverbal assessment. Because what this does is it pulls out all the language. And so you can get a sense of what the student's cognitive abilities are. So then when you get a verbal IQ score, if it is lower than the nonverbal IQ score, then you can see that their language is impacting them in significant ways. Because a lot of times our students will score low on these Woodcock Johnson tests or all of these assessments. And so they may be identified as being special ed or having a cognitive delay or having a learning disability. But everything is so language based that we really cannot pull out the language component of it and how the hearing loss is impacting their ability to perform on these tests. But when you use a nonverbal IQ, then that pulls the language out. So, opposite of the Sturgis schools, we have Campton Elementary School in Campton, New Hampshire. And just recently, CBS did a story about a boy who was the only one in his school who was deaf. So, his classmates started picking up on signs. He used an interpreter, he used sign. His classmates started picking up on the simple signs to begin with: clean up and help me and let's play, different things like that. The next thing they knew, the rest of the class started learning these signs. And then the teachers that he worked with started learning signs. And then all the other kids all the other teachers in the school, and then they incorporated it into every day. And even when the student wasn't around, every kid in the school incorporated their signing into their daily structure. Here is Campton School. And this is our little boy, and this is the school. And here is every kid in the gymnasium signing with their friend from the school. So, this is a beautiful example of how you can take a single child in the classroom and you can not only support their language needs amongst their own development, but you can expand it to their peers and the school and the entire school at large. This actually is something that I have supported a number of schools with, and it is incredibly amazing when schools take it on and they do it. So, let's talk about the ways that we can do the same thing. And after this, I'm going to share what, when a school maybe wouldn't want to do these things, and what to do when you hear some of these comments, these pushback comments. I want to do a little preface. I'm talking about teaching sign language. A lot of times we use the word ASL, right? That's what we talk about. We want to make sure that our student has got ASL. And ASL is our big buzzword. And it is exactly what we see when we Google anything. But ASL, as we know, is its own language. It has its own grammar, it has its own syntax. And for a student who's got some auditory excess, then American Sign Language, ASL in its purest form, may not be the best fit for this student. We may want to do something like something that's conceptually accurate sign language that is an auditory support for them. Or we might want to do cued speech or some other option like that. But the goal is that it is a visual option that is going to provide visual access to the curriculum. So, just to reiterate this, anytime I might say ASL or the word sign language, you can replace that just with sign language in general or with the word cued speech. So, let me give you 6 ways to teach a student sign language and make it meaningful and useful to them. All right. Tip number 1, we want to provide time every day for voice off language immersion. So this is just conversation back and forth where the voice is off so that your child can learn this language foundation in sign language. So you can do this with a teacher of the deaf. You can do this with an interpreter. We can have another student who signs come in and just play and just chat. Without that ability to have this natural give and take experience, our student is not going to be able to build that solid language foundation. By the time we're in about 3rd grade and up, really, students are being talked at, that's being lectured at most of the time, and very little back and forth engagement and very little one-on-one engagements unless they're in a quiet room, one-on-one setting, which of course is an ideal placement for our students, but not at all, of course, where they spend the majority of their day. All right. Number 2, we can provide meaningful sign language classes to the students and to the class. So I love this example. We in school grow up having English class every year for 12 years, right? We've got English class. Even though we are proficient English speakers, we're native English speakers, we are surrounded by English all the time. And yet, our students who are deaf who sign very rarely actually have a formal sign language class. And how beneficial is that for them if they can have a formal sign language class? But also, their peers. We should set up sign language classes or a class or station for their peers to be able to learn sign language. So, what could this look like? I love the Daily 5. So I love setting up a sign language station within this Daily 5 as part of the language station. And we can set it up as a computer class for them. There's lots of computer online classes I personally love called signschool.com. It's a free sign language program, great for kids, but there's other ones too. You can set this up as computer stations for all the kids, but for your deaf student as well. Obviously, you can have the teacher of the deaf come in and work on this sign language instruction for all the kids. You can have the deaf role model do it, the interpreter do it. So very valuable to be able to teach this to the entire class. This is one of my favorites. This does require the teacher to have a little bit of buy-in to it, but I like to have the teacher embed voice off time into their day every single day. This is especially effective at the elementary level, but let's have voice off time during class and it's immersion for the whole class. So, what does this look like? We teach all the kids the numbers, and then we have math assignments, or we go through the math answers and we do it in sign language. So, the kids have to do the numbers with their fingers in math class. They teach the math expressions and everything in sign. And then your math, when you're going through the problems, can be in sign for all the kids. Calendar is a great way to embed and incorporate signs with the whole class. I have had wonderful success having the elementary classes have the entire calendar done in sign language, and all the peers are learning the activities that are happening for the day, the days of the week, today, tomorrow, next week, all of the food that's happening in the cafeteria, all of the jobs, the daily jobs that are happening. This is the language, especially in our elementary level, of course, that is the daily language that the kids can share and converse with their deaf peer. My favorite reading station is the silent reading corner. And this is the corner where all you have are picture books, wordless picture books. And you require students to go into the corner and read books to each other without ever using a word. And what do? They gesture, they use charades, they use the signs that they know, they use their facial expression, but they truly start to connect by using body language and signs without ever needing to use their words. And this overflows in a big way to all of the class and throughout all of the day. The next tip is to send the child to summer camp where they can connect and meet other peers who sign. This is one of the most undervalued opportunities and not something that schools push, but something that should absolutely be pushed for our students because this is where they meet their peers. This is where they get to play. This is where they get access to other kids and they get to feel like this is normalized inside their setting. So, very important, really valuable to talk about and share with families. The next thing that's so important is to have the conversation with the families and maybe take a visit to the deaf school with the family and offer it. It's actually required to talk about this at the IEP meeting and to document that it's been talked about and decided as if it is an option for a placement or not. Time after time again, we hear families that say, I never knew that I had an option. I never knew there was another thing out there. Nobody ever told me. And families kind of get a little bit upset when they don't know or don't understand, and it hasn't ever been presented to them as something that is out there. So none of these things were in place for the Perez case. In fact, his one-on-one aide didn't even learn sign language. What happened in the Perez case is that the family won the lawsuits. It was identified that the school did not provide access to his curriculum. All right. So even though he had a one on one, he had somebody who was communicating with him, he never was able to fully learn sign language. And the interpreter, the aide, never fully learned sign language. And so he was in his classes without access to his curriculum. And the family won this landmark case. So under IDEA, they had to provide educational services to make up for the loss of FAPE. They had to pay for attendance at the Michigan School for the Deaf and provide additional compensatory education and pay for sign language classes for the entire family. But that was under IDEA. So IDEA is, of course, where we're creating compensatory services for education. But then they went on and they continued and they actually sued for damages under ADA. They sued for emotional harm and lost education. This was a monetary pursuit. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted 9-0 in favor of the family. So this is really important. And I like to really think of it back in the school's perspective because the school really felt like they were providing appropriate services for the students. They felt like they were giving him somebody that could communicate with him. They were putting him in the mainstream, which they felt was LRE. He also had special ed, and he was just going through and he was just being passed. But at this point, any school who's debating providing access to an interpreter, I really plead with those schools to really evaluate the access that they are providing for their students. And if their student does not have access, then we really have to come to the table to really pick this apart and identify what we can do to provide access. There are, of course, many reasons that I hear that schools don't want to provide an interpreter, even when it's determined that the student doesn't have adequate access. So here are the top 4 reasons that schools resist using an interpreter, and this is what to do if this is your school. All right. So reason number 1, the student lives in a hearing world. We shouldn't be trying to provide them with an interpreter because that's not the world that they live in. They don't have a deaf community around them. They live in the hearing world. Therefore, we are not going to provide them with sign language because that is not their environment. So just because a student lives in a hearing world does not mean it's okay to deprive a student of access to their education. So if we're getting the pushback that the student lives in a hearing world, we can express that it doesn't make them any less hearing or any less of able to maneuver in the hearing world. It just provides access to their education. So they're actually more equipped to maneuver around the hearing world because they'll have better reading, better language, better all of the things. Just to add this extra support does not mean they're going to lose anything else. All right, number 2 thing that I hear, the school doesn't have funding. Right? We don't have any money for an interpreter. We can't afford that. I hear that all the time. Here's the thing. School districts are provided with money to provide their needs for students. Funding is there. Just like we have a budget, we've got to figure out how much are we going to pay for rent? How much do we save for vacation? How much do we have for food? Whoops, when something happens that we need to get a new roof for the house or the car breaks down, That just means that we have to move money around in our budget. That is exactly what schools are required to do. The funding is there. They just have to move money around. So we can't say that we don't have any money for an interpreter, just like we can't say we don't have any money to provide a bus. So how schools do this is maybe it impacts the professional development fund that they've got. Maybe it impacts another fund, but they move the money around to be able to find the funding for what their students need. The third pushback I hear is that the school can't find an interpreter, right? We posted the position, we can't find an interpreter. And that is exactly what happened in the Perez case. They posted for an interpreter, they couldn't find an interpreter, so they brought on a communication aide, but that person never actually learned sign language. So she had just her own little communication system with Miguel. They got along fine, but it wasn't actually a language, and he didn't have access to his curriculum because she was not communicating with him. She did not give him that language foundation. So if your school cannot find an interpreter, that just means they need to train somebody. That means they need to go through the steps like what we saw with this other student in New Hampshire. They need to be able to get somebody on board to be able to learn those skills. All right. And the last one, which is the one that to me is the most frustrating one, but I see it all the time, is that they would rather use an AC device. They feel like an AC device is going to be a better way to provide communication back and forth because here's the reason that we get, right? That if an interpreter isn't there, then they have the AAC device to be able to use to go back and forth and communicate. Here's our problem with that is that the AC device does not provide access to the curriculum. AC device is a communication device for outputs, right? Not for input. It does not provide access to our curriculum. It can be used in combo with an interpreter, of course, or with that sign language, but it cannot be used in place of it. And I think oftentimes people just don't understand this. They think that, oh, if the student has this device, that means it's taken care of. If they can have a conversation with me, that means that it's taken care of. Oh, so important to be able to provide the data that shows the access that they have, but also the gaps that they have and the lack of progress that they're having. The next pushback that I get from students or from families is that they don't want it. The students themselves don't want it because they don't want to be different. They feel like there's some stigma to that. That means that their needs just really need to be normalized and supported. That's one reason that I created the deaf identity section inside the professional academy. There's a giant library of people who communicate in different ways. There's a whole section that allows them to compare and contrast themselves. And it really provides this opportunity to normalize hearing loss and provide the information of how different people access information. So to summarize, we just talked about 5 ways to help a student learn sign language. And we also addressed the 4 reasons that schools don't want to provide sign access to a student and why those reasons actually need to be worked through. So I want to show you a couple more trainings inside the YouTube channel that also provide this information. All right, that's it.